This series is called Human Dignity in the Marketplace, and we're looking at this question over the course of four lectures. The first one was a month ago, and that was about labor. Tonight, we're looking at liberty and the value of, so each one is the value. So the value of labor was last month. The value of liberty is this month. In the new year, we'll be looking at the value of virtue, and then finally, the value of charity. So I hope that you keep your eye open for that. Our speaker this evening is Father Raymond de Souza. As I mentioned, he's a senior fellow at Cardus for the Work in Economics program, but he also has a relatively a less well-known expertise in economics. He studied economics. He did an MA at Cambridge University, and he also teaches economics at Queen's University. You probably recognize him most from the National Post, where he's a columnist on Saturdays. And he's also a parish priest about 45 minutes south of Ottawa in Holy Cross Parish in Kemptville. So I'd like, if we could welcome Father Raymond, and he will begin the lecture.
Thank you, Renze, for the introduction. That's the first time I've ever been introduced where they said he has lesser known expertise in the subject which he's now addressing. He didn't say lesser expertise, but it could be maybe the same thing. So, but it's a good way of introducing our topic, which is not principally focused on economics. I mean, it's about economics, our four-part lecture series, but it comes at looking at economics from the point of view of a broader lens of human dignity in the marketplace, which is informed by, for the purposes of this lecture series, our Christian understanding of the human person, human society, etc. So, like the first lecture, we're going to look at or explore how might Christians think about economic matters, with particular focus on liberty tonight, as we did labor or work last time. So that's our outline, and I'm proposing that we look at this question of the value of liberty from an economic point of view in two ways. One is why economic liberty is important from a Christian point of view, and also why economics can be understood in a very positive way. I propose to you if we think of it in terms of it as the study of liberty. So that's our plan for the evening. Renzo reminded me when I came tonight that the last lecture I gave, for reasons I'm not quite sure, I had 12 words that all began with C in order to organize my thoughts, but I didn't require that this time. So there's no, there are no 12 C's of this lecture. Just there's no gimmicks in this lecture. It's just hopefully good substance. When I was a young man in the 1990s, a very influential figure in my thinking was Michael Novak. Michael Novak was not an economist. He was a philosopher and a theologian. But in the 1970s, he started to write about, from a Catholic point of view, economic affairs. And what distinguished him was that he was particularly interested in economic liberty and very confident in the importance of economic liberty for economic productivity. And this set him apart because most most Christian writers who take an interest in economic affairs do not put a primary emphasis on liberty. Their primary emphasis is usually maybe on equality, or if you put it in a different way, combating inequality, on justice, on fairness, on redistribution. Those are the poverty. Those are the kinds of things that, generally speaking, at least at the time when Michael Novak was writing, were of focus. And if you start off, for example, by being worried about inequality, then you're concerned about redistribution, likely, and the only agent large enough to redistribute on a big scale would be the government. So you tend to become more favorable towards government interventions in the economy. if you start off with liberty, you come to a bit different conclusions. And maybe in the question period, we can talk about how that's been traced out. But the point is that Michael Novak, very influential. He was a sort of a solitary figure in the Catholic world at the time. By the time he died, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, he was no longer solitary. He had a big influence. He was very well followed in the probably the last decade or so of the Cold War in the communist countries, because they saw someone who articulated a vision for economic freedom that wasn't just a practical thing, but also in principle. He used to say something that was quite striking, and that's where I want to start tonight. He would say that economic freedom is the second most important freedom, which is not how we usually think about it. If you ask someone, what are the most important freedoms? The freedom of the press, freedom of association, legal rights, political rights, very few people would give such prominence to economic freedom. And his argument was, he said, the first most important freedom is religious liberty, or freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, whatever term you want to use. He said, because if you're not free there, then you're not free anywhere. If you're not free in the, to believe or to worship, then all your other liberties are eroded. But he said, after that, the second most important freedom is economic freedom. And he said, it's not because economic activity is more important than freedom of speech or freedom of association or those other foundational freedoms we think about. And he wasn't arguing that it was more important. But he said, practically speaking, that's where we spend most of our life. So economic freedom is where we spend most of our life. You can go a whole day quite easily without exercising freedom of the press. Right? You may not choose to read the news, or you might not choose to publish a newspaper that day, right? You could go conceivably a day without exercising your freedom of association. Right? Maybe specifically, probably you are in some associations, but it's impossible to go any length of time without doing some economic activity, right? If you live somewhere, like in a building, if you pay rent, if you have a mortgage, if you own it, if you eat, right? If you go someplace, if you're not walking, probably you have some kind of cost associated with that. So his point is that if you have economic liberty, it touches a lot of aspects of your life. If you don't have economic liberty, it also touches lots of aspects of your life, right? And this insight was advanced by some thinkers who were very convinced promoters of the market, free market, because of its efficiency or growth. But they also would underscore, I'm thinking of people here like Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek, who would say that independent of the better outcomes, being free in the economic sphere is a good in itself, because it touches so much aspects. So if you're interested in freedom, if you have a value for liberty, then you will want to pay attention to economic freedom, because it touches so many different aspects of life. So we're meeting here on November 22nd, 2023. So if you looked at some of the news today, you may have seen that it's the 60th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, 60 years ago today in Dallas, which it is, but I'm not going to talk about that. But also the 60th anniversary of the death of C.S. Lewis. They died on the same day. And also Aldous Huxley of Brave New World fame. So they all died on the same day. There's a very interesting book written by a Catholic philosopher named Peter Kreeft, which imagines the three of them after death having a conversation, mainly about theological topics, about, who is Jesus Christ? Is he believable? Is he real? So on and so forth. It's called Between Heaven and Hell. So if you find the entirety of tonight's lecture a waste of your time, which I hope you don't, at least you'll know a reference to a good book that you could read that will not be a waste of your time. So that's Peter Kreeft, Between Heaven and Hell. But C.S. Lewis, so those three probably the most important, John F. Kennedy is a historical, political figure, but both Huxley and Lewis had a very penetrating critique of, the modern society. And, Aldous Huxley's Brave New Worlds, written in 1932, predicted many things that are come to pass about, if you want to say, the erosion of human identity and flourishing confronted by large scale enterprises, including the state. And C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, which I think is 1938, also made some of the same points. But he was a Christian, and so there's a little difference there. But I thought, given the anniversary, we should at least quote something from C.S. Lewis, which is not an easy task, because there's a lot of things to choose from, and then you start to choose one, then you choose everything, and then all of a sudden you just have a C.S. Lewis recital. It's not actually a talk, but just one quotation. Well, I'll start with one now. So this is from something called Is Progress Possible from 1958. This is C.S. Lewis. It says, I believe a man is happier and happy in a richer way if he has the freeborn mind. So he's talking about having a kind of interior freedom, especially an intellectual freedom and a spiritual freedom. But I doubt whether he can have this without economic independence, which the new society is abolishing. So it's 1958. So Lewis's point is that there's a kind of interior freedom that he thinks is difficult to have without economic independence. And this is what he says. For economic independence allows an education not controlled by government. Lewis was very concerned about the question of education, how it was done. Of course, he was an Oxford and Cambridge professor for most of his adult life. And he said, economic independence gives you the capacity to be educated, not controlled by the government. So rather important to us at Cardus. We spend a lot of time on independent education. And in adult life, he continues, it is the man who asks nothing of the government, who can criticize its acts and snap his fingers at its ideology. So he's making a point there that if you are, like anything in life, if you are dependent on something economically, it's harder to criticize it, right? I mean, that applies in almost all spheres of life, except probably to teenagers who are wholly dependent on their parents, but seem to have no trouble criticizing them or snapping their fingers at them, or much worse, I'm afraid to say. But aside from teenagers, but notice, the reason I'm thinking of that is he says in adult life, he said. So I'm not sure what he had in mind, but I think maybe he's talking about that compared to teenagers. But so economic liberty then, if you're concerned about liberty or related things like liberty for education or liberty for religious formation, liberty for scholarship, in his case, Lewis, then you have to be concerned about economic freedom. So having established that, I think is why we might be interested in this as one of our 4 lectures. Let me then suggest or indicate 2 ways that we're going to go about it. One is to look at what economics actually studies in its relation to freedom. And then the second is how the study of economics can be understood, maybe differently than you're used to understanding it, if you put that, keep that in mind, that it's the study of freedom. So one of the important things is to understand what the object of a discipline is. A lot of confusion and sometimes even conflict can arise because you get the category wrong. Right? So think of, for example, religious believers and scientists can sometimes have even heated disputes, but it's usually because there's a mistake of a category, right? So, for example, an astronomer, even a very gifted astronomer, can tell you many things about how the cosmos works, but he can't tell you why something exists as opposed to not existing. You can't do astronomy unless things are already existing, right? You can't do science unless there's something to observe. So certain questions, strictly we call them metaphysical questions, beyond physics, literally, are not for astronomers to tell us, right? Likewise, some very famous conflicts in the history of science and religion arise when religious believers may interpret their sacred texts in a way that is not correct and that they're read as a scientific document as opposed to a conveyance of philosophical or theological wisdom, right? So you have to know what your category is. That's the key thing, right? So say knowing what physics is versus, metaphysics. Or to use a different example, I mean, if I was to ask you, tell me about, what's your name? William. So if I asked you, tell me about William, and you said, well, William is, I don't know, 42% nitrogen. I don't know how much nitrogen is the human body? I don't know. Does 42% sound right? I don't know. Let's presume that it's 42%. That would be a correct statement, right? So, okay, tell me about William, 42% nitrogen. But it's probably not what I was asking, or not what I was interested in, right? I wasn't really looking for a biochemical answer. It's not a wrong answer, but I wasn't really asking a biochemical question. Now, if I was a surgeon in an operating theater and I said, tell me about William to whoever else, maybe I would be interested in something like that, what the composition of his blood was at that moment. But likely if I say to you, tell me about William, I'm actually interested in his, his character, his personality. And so the discipline that you're using is not biochemistry to answer, but probably literature. You'll tell me a story about him, right? That's how we normally would answer that question. I'll tell you a story about, this. Or maybe I'll turn to history and say, these are the facts of his history. This is where he's from. This is what he used to do. But probably history and literature are the disciplines we would use for that, right? So, and sometimes there's a mix of disciplines like music. So what is music? Music is, well, in one way it's mathematics, right? Music is, if you know how to read music, you're reading graphs and proportions and ratios and so forth. But it's also poetry. There's a literature component. So when someone talks about a favorite song, he's not usually reflecting on sort of the acoustics of it, but maybe if it has words, the meaning of the words. If it doesn't have words, it might be some kind of response, right? So that's the importance of the category. If you get the wrong category, you don't understand what something is about. So what is the object of economics? What do economists look at? What do we observe? If I were to ask you, probably you'd say something, would say, transactions, some might say money and so on, which are all correct, but they're not, I think, fundamental or foundational enough. So if you say, what do economists actually observe? What do we look at in the world? So you send a biologist out to a field station, and what does the biologist look for? He looks at the living creatures there and whatever interests him, right? Or an astronomer uses a telescope and looks at the position of the stars or whatever else and draws measurements and then proceeds from there. So what economists look at, what we observe are exchanges. That's what we observe, right? So if you get a big statistical report from one of our economic data agencies, they'll tell you, so many cars were sold last quarter, so many bushels of grain, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an aggregate of transactions, exchanges. Right? So we observe people making exchanges. That's what we observe, right? In individual or usually in large numbers, we observe people making exchanges. And then we have a important qualifier, essential, is we say that these exchanges are voluntary. Right? They're voluntary exchanges, which is quite critical. And if you observe an exchange and it's voluntary, then you can make a conclusion, which is defensible, that the exchange is seen by both parties as advantageous. Right? So if it's free to enter into the exchange or not, and you do it, it means that you think that there's some reason that it's a good thing to make this exchange. It's beneficial to me. Right? So I'm willing to use my resources, exchange in this way for something else. And you can make that claim if it's a genuinely free exchange. So that's what we observe. We observe exchanges and we assume they're voluntary. If exchange is not voluntary, then it's hard to do economics properly understood. You can still measure things and so forth, but it's not really economics in the sense of making conclusions about what people value, what their preferences are, what they're trying to maximize, to use the term we often use in economics, what they gain utility from. We use the term utility. You can sort of say usefulness, what they find useful. And eventually, all of this is directed towards enhancing their welfare. Right? So that's the basic model we have of how people, or what an economist does when he looks out at the world, is looks at these voluntary exchanges. And that might seem just sort of very uninteresting or, banal even, but I don't think it is, because if we're looking at what people do voluntarily, then we're looking at how they use their freedom. Now, you may think whether, if I stop in somewhere and buy a coffee at the local Tim Hortons, I wouldn't say a lot of my freedom is engaged in that. That's not some great cause, to which I'm devoting my last full measure of devotion or anything like that. But it is freedom. It is, you didn't have to go there. You went there. In all the many things you could have done, you chose to do this, right? So it's a use of your freedom. No, I shouldn't say no, but the vast majority of our economic transactions are not major determinants of how we decide to use our freedom. But if you take them all together, they touch almost every aspect of our day. Some of them obviously touch a big aspect of our day. So for example, what we do with our labor. Right? So I sell my labor, we call that employment. Right? That's a big day. That's a big deal. And it's a big deal because if you don't have employment, if you're unemployed, that's not just an economic problem. It touches your whole experience. Right? I'm not free to devote my energies, efforts towards some productive task. It's not just about what you're paid. So I propose to my students that economics can be understood as the science of human freedom, which makes it sound very noble, contrary to what most people think when they first think about economics. Especially amongst religious people, there's actually the opposite inclination, which is to somehow think economics is very grubby. It's about transactions, about money, it's about material things, and those things are less important than spiritual things. And so there's can be a kind of disdain. But just because something is not as important as something else doesn't mean it's not important in itself. Right? Just because a material good is not as important as a spiritual good, just because a salary is not as important as salvation doesn't mean it doesn't have an importance in itself, right? And I'm not going to repeat what I said last time, but last lecture was about what it means to work and how that touches so much of who we are and who we become, in addition to just the economic transaction of it. But that was last time's lecture, so I won't repeat that. But this idea then is that the discipline that allows us to observe human freedom being worked out on a daily basis that touches all aspects of life is economics, right? Consider how important we think that political freedom is, right? So there's an election, right? There's an election, the most recent one I think was in Argentina. If you're an economist, got a lot of attention, right? Because the fellow who won the election has some economic views that are outside the mainstream of Argentinian economic history. But if you know Argentinian economic history, you might think that's precisely why people are interested in views outside the mainstream. They've had a modest, rough patch of 100 plus years in Argentina on the economic front. But anyway, people are interested in political decisions. Right? They say, okay, the X country goes to vote, there's an election, and huge implications are drawn from that vote. This is where the culture is, this is how the country's developing, this is what's important to people, all those things. Just from one vote every 4 years, right? Well, economics, you do more than one vote. You have many transactions every day. So if you're interested in what a culture is about, if you're interested in what motivates a society or what's important to it, economics is at least as important as politics, even though people tend to pay more attention to political aspects, right? So my argument is not that economics is the only science of human freedom. It's not. Not that it's the most important use of human freedom. It's not. But that it's the most common experience of freedom. Human freedom is in the economic sphere. That's where we exercise our freedom most often. And therefore, economics can be exercised in, I think, a very noble way to look at the human person in what makes the human person distinctive, right? That our capacity for freedom makes us distinctive from the animals. And so when we look at human freedom, we look at economics, we're looking at what distinctively makes us human. I'm going to develop that in the second part. So that's really the first submission, is to say that if you value liberty, then, and you accept that this economics is the science of human freedom, in part, then you should have a positive view of what economics can contribute to understanding both individuals and societies, either large societies or small societies. So, so that's my first main point. Second point, or second section, is to talk about how thinking about economics this way can change the way we think from how we might think. Now, I don't know what your backgrounds are and how you think about economics, but you may have heard the expression sometimes used in relation to economics called the dismal science, right? Have you heard that? You've heard that term? I've taken a bit of offense at that, because what other discipline has this sort of negative term associated with, right? You don't hear about sort of, dismal biology, or biology being the dismal science, or anything, or physics. But anyway, this term dismal science. Anybody know where it comes from, the term dismal science? What's that? Wow, Thomas Carlyle. That's the fastest answer I've ever got. Amazing. Are you an economist?
No.
No, but you read Thomas Carlyle?
I've read a little bit.
Wow.
But he's quoted through other readers.
Okay, all right. Well, very good. That's it. That question is now retired for the rest of my lecturing career.
Google it.
No, you're right. You're right. No, you're correct. Yeah, I know the answer. Right? That's why. But now that you've answered it, before I finish the question, then I'm never going to answer it again. Ask it again, because I'm never going to get a better response. So, do you know why Thomas Carlyle said that? What's that? Okay, wow. I'm going to just sit down. This is pretty good. Unsurprisingly, this is a more engaged and responsive group than second-year undergraduates. Okay. So yes, so Thomas Malthus. Okay, let me continue. When did Thomas Malthus live? Do you know? When did Thomas Malthus? When was he writing?
Oh, you're talking about 1850.
Wow. Okay, this is great. Okay, all right. So Thomas Carlyle's 19th century. Malthus is before, and so Thomas Malthus, who's the more famous of the two, from where we get the term Malthusian. You probably have heard that term, Malthusian. So Thomas Malthus's argument was that he studied basically agricultural yields, and his argument was that, I don't have the economist blackboard here to make we usually can't get through any length of time without making a graph of something, but we don't need a graph. Malthus's view was that agricultural yields increase on an arithmetic basis. So if you have the slope of the line would be like a linear, like an upward sloping line like this. Arithmetic increase, more or less. That's what he thought. But then he said population, so that would mean that it increases at the same ratio every year, sort of thing, like your productivity of your field. But he said population grows in a geometric way, which is that it starts out more slowly and then turns up like half of a U, kind of like this, right? So if you can imagine that, because as you know, if you have two children and your two children have two children, then there's four, and if those four children have two children, now you're at eight, and et cetera. So even if the same number of children are born, generation by generation, it's not a straight line. It becomes this accelerating function, so we call it a geometric function as opposed to an arithmetic function. And if you have that, sooner or later, the geometric function will exceed the arithmetic function. Okay, that's as mathematical as our talk gets tonight. Point being, more people than food, right? That's the key point. So he said, well, if you get more people than food, people are going to starve. That was his theory. And Carlyle, then commenting on this work, said, well, what a dismal science that is. It just tells us at roughly what point we can expect people to starve, right? So hence the dismal science. So really, it's not a comment on the entire discipline of economics, but it was a comment on one particular bit of economic work. But it stuck. That's what's interesting. That's not so interesting that Thomas Carlyle said that about Thomas Malthus's work, but that it stuck. People seem to think, aha, that's an excellent name. That's what we've been looking for these economists. It's a dismal science. So the name stuck. Now, why might that be? Why might that be? And now what I hope to do is to sort of show how there is a way of looking at economics that is dismal. But there's another way or better way to looking at economics that actually I think is not only not dismal, but actually quite hopeful, or even, if I might say, joyful, which is probably a bit of a stretch. I've never heard, I don't think I'll ever persuade enough people to think of economics as the joyful science. But if you open any economics textbook, first-year economics textbook, and the first couple of pages, which describe sort of the basic concepts in economics, one of the first things you'll come across is the idea of scarcity. It might even be in the first paragraph of the first page, right? But it's there early on. And scarcity for economists means that the available resources, whatever the available resources are, the possible uses of those exceed what exists. So the wants, desires, aspirations, whatever, more than the resources. That's what we mean by scarcity. So scarcity prevails even when somebody has a lot of things. So it doesn't mean there's not enough, right? So if you imagine someone who doesn't have enough to eat, they say, well, that's real scarcity. Okay, he doesn't have enough to eat. But scarcity also prevails in someone who could have a lot of resources, but the wants, competing uses, we could say, are greater than the available resources, which is basically to say that resources are finite, right? They're finite by definition, and desires are infinite, right? So this is a profound spiritual problem, but we're not talking about spirituality today. So that's where we get this idea of scarcity. So people doing their first-year economics course are told about the world as a world of scarcity. And you can stop and think about that and say, okay, the world is a world of scarcity. Well, that's a bit depressing, because it means that no matter how good things get, you're always frustrated, right? And we know that, especially from a Christian point of view, because we'll say things very easily to people that, if you're not content with what you've got now, even if you had more, you still won't be content. Or don't keep on chasing something because you'll never be satisfied, right? Or material goods. We give that kind of advice very easily. But there is this reality that if if scarcity is the condition within which we study economics, that's a depressing look at things, because it means we're always frustrated, right? We're always frustrated. We're never satisfied. Even if we got this exchange right, in general, we're dissatisfied. Now, this is a bit of a problem for a Christian, because the Christian view of the created order, the material order, is that it was created in original abundance. Right? So the account that we have of God's providence is that it's abundant, right? So we see that in the first pages of Genesis, for example, about the description of a kind of an abundant world of abundance. And then we have all these phrases which come up throughout the Old Testament, in the Psalms, in the Gospels as well, where there's a vision of material abundance, right? So we have phrases from the Gospel like, you know, your cup will be overflowing, right? Or a good measure pressed down, flowing over. Some of those are metaphors for something else, but there's this idea very much in the scripture of a world of abundance, not a world of scarcity. Now, it's easy enough to say, well, the world became scarce because of the consequence of sin and rivalry and so forth. Fine. But that means that if economics is about scarcity, economics is about the world of sin. Right? Which in a way it is, because everything's about the world of sin if you're studying human beings. But emphasizing that emphasizes the, if you want to say, what's lacking in creation as opposed to what's present in creation. So if that's our starting point, and it is the starting point for many people, you get into the idea, rather the idea of scarcity gives you that a negative view of economics. Now, the reason that that first page of the economics textbooks talks about scarcity is because what it's going to do is talk about exchanges, in which you take what you have and exchange it for something else. That is, you make a exchange or you make a trade. And from that, we look at trade-offs and comparisons, right? That there's trades and comparisons. So if there's one thing that distinguishes how economists think about the world, as opposed to, say, people like political or historians or literature people, it's the question of trade-offs, right? So if you talk to someone who's completely political, I mean small p political, in his outlook, if you say, why doesn't something happen? He will probably say because there's a lack of will, a lack of coordination, opposition from somebody, whatever. So it could be done. An economist would likely, or if you ask a historian or a novelist, they would give a similar kind of answer. An economist would usually say, well, the trade-off, the cost of doing that, the actual cost or the opportunity cost prevents it from being done, even if we don't see that right away. And sometimes the work of an economist is to try and figure out what actually the costs are that would prevent that from happening, right? So that's that's one of the most distinctive characteristics about economists, is that we look at the world in terms of trade-offs, right? If you think of economists working, say, in this town, you know, many of them work in the government, and you know, the government produces budgets, right? We had a kind of a fall budget or economic update yesterday or the day before yesterday, or anyway, this week. Well, what's a budget, right? Whether it's a household budget or a budget for a whole country, you have to trade off. You can't, you know, if you have so much money, you can't spend it on two things at the same time, right? Or you have to borrow, whatever. But you have to, there's a trade-off. You can't just list everything you want and say, okay, now I'm finished. Right? You have to look at what your resources are. Right? So when we look at limits and trade-offs, I would say that's moderately dismal. It's not totally dismal like scarcity is, but it's moderately dismal because, okay, the moderation comes by the fact that if you're trading something, there's something you desire. So, you know, there's something here that I desire that now I can achieve or I can have. That but I still have to pay for it. I have to trade it. So there's the idea of limits, the idea of trade-off can give us a moderately dismal, not totally dismal, but moderately dismal look at economics. But then we take it one step further and say, well, how do you go about doing that? Like, how do you make your decisions about what trade-offs to make and what not trade-offs to make? So what am I going to do? So someone looks at, he's got his resources and he looks at the options available to him. And then he decides what he's going to do or how he's going to act. And what he's doing in a certain sense is he's comparing his motivations or measuring his motivations against the trade-offs, circumstances in front of him, right? And that sounds a bit nebulous, I know, I put it that way. But the word we use for that is responding to incentives, which that we understand, right? So you look at the world and you say, okay, if this is easier for me to do, that's more difficult for me to do. I really value this, so I'm going to do the more difficult thing. I really value it, even though this is easier. But if I have two things that are relatively the same in terms of my value, I'll respond if there's incentive to do the cheaper thing, right? So that's why, there's been a recent discussion in the country about carbon taxes, right? Carbon taxes, other taxes like that. There's a name for them, Pigouvian taxes, but actually, I think for twice in my 20-year column writing career, I did columns on Pigouvian taxes. They were 4 years apart, and the one was 2 weeks ago, so it'll be another 4 years minimum before I return to that subject. I don't know, maybe the editor would like it, I don't know, but I don't want to try his patience on that. But anyway, taxes try and change incentives, right? So we put a tax. Certain taxes don't try to change incentives, right? The income tax doesn't really try to change your incentives, but put a tax on this thing, we want you to buy less of it, put a tax on that thing, or take a tax off the other thing. But when we come to incentives, all of a sudden the focus goes, you see, from the limits in the world that we face to my reaction, how I stand before this world with its limits, and what's important to me, and how I evaluate things, and what my motivations are, and then I make my decision. And now we're beginning to describe something. You see, we're going from the external world with its limits, which might sound dismal if the limits are severe, the world of Malthusian scarcity, for example. But when I turn to my own motivation, so now you begin to see my creativity. Right? I'm now being creative in response to the world around me. Right? Now, we admire that in certain circumstances, right? If somebody invents something, we admire that. Someone's stuck out in the woods, for whatever, gets lost in the woods for a couple of weeks, and all the things he has to creatively do to get water and food or shelter, we admire that. But that creativity can be used we admire it in the arts, composer, a novelist, or even a newspaper columnist, perhaps. But that creativity is also used every time you go into, I don't know, a hamburger joint, and you see all the choices there, and you try and figure out how much you want to spend. And, if you order a combination, 11C, that's this combination of things, and it's only 3% more expensive than combination, 16F. And so I'm going to choose that, right? You make some kind of decision. There's all kinds of decisions like that. And we experience this because they're probably not at a fast food joint, but there are times when we come up with a solution to something and it gives us a lot of, we're excited by it. I figured out a way to make this happen. If I wait to buy something on sale or whatever, I can make this happen. So now we're not talking about anything dismal at all, right? It's not even dismal at all. In fact, it's a science of, but you could say maybe an admiration, right? To admire the creativity of the human person in his circumstance, right? Think of all those nature shows people watch. We watch these nature shows, and we're amazed at, how the lioness, is in the bushes and stalks ever so slowly, and then finally, at the critical moment, finds the baby zebra and tears it limb from limb, right? And we're admiring of that, and we say that's magnificent how she did that. Or maybe not the baby zebra, but the crippled old zebra who can barely run, and she rips it a piece with her, and we admire that, right? They make big documentaries out of it, and people love to watch it. Well, we should be more impressed by the person who, facing circumstances, is able to provide food and shelter for a family. It's more impressive than a lioness tearing apart a half-dead aged zebra, right? So we can admire it. So you say now maybe economics is more not dismal but admirable, right? About how incentives and creativity go together. And then you take it one step further and say, well, the reason I can respond to incentives is because I'm free, right? I have a choice. Right? I have a choice. And we take that for granted. Right? Imagine if you were, I don't know, back in a restaurant. You're sitting in a restaurant. We went to a restaurant earlier, Renze and I, and the woman came over and she said, "What would you like to choose on the menu?" Imagine if she had said, "Okay, you look like you should have the steak. That's what he had anyway. You should have the pasta. That's what I had." But she just chose it for us. Right? Now, even if I actually wanted the pasta and he wanted the steak, which apparently we did because we ordered it, we would resent that. Say, "You can't choose for me. I choose for myself." Then she would say, "Well, what do you want?" That's, "I want the pasta." He said, "I just said you're getting the pasta. Why are you upset?" Be a good point. Should have a point. But I'd say, "Well, it's not that. It's I'm going to choose it. Thank you very much. Right? I'm going to choose it. You're not going to choose it for me." And she might say, "Well, I chose what you wanted anyway." You'd say, "That's not the point. Right? I want to choose it." So now we arrive at the ideas where I started, another half, the talk, first half, on the science of human freedom. Right? Is that the fact that I can respond to incentives, the fact that I can use my creativity means that I'm free. Right? And so if that's what this economic studies, you get, it's a very noble way. And I would say even if it's admirable, the science of incentives and creativity, then, you know, the science of liberty maybe you could say it's a joyful science, not a dismal science. Okay, one final point here, and then the other thing, if we pursue with this line and we say, okay, here you have freedom, people exercising their freedom, but the freedom is not just on one side, right? It's not just on my side. So I face a world, and then I exercise my freedom to make my choices in that world. The other agents in the world are also free. Right? So economics, if we're studying voluntary exchanges, is actually studying the meeting of human freedoms. Right? So our freedom in the restaurant meets the freedom of the chef, the freedom of the owner, the freedom of the waitress. Right? And we coordinate that. With my student, I teach in the morning, not what I would consider early in the morning, 8:30, 10 o'clock. But when I was my students' age, I also always thought that was like very early in the morning, 8:30 in the morning. Drag yourself down there. So some of them arrive with, well, they all arrive, of course, with their big water, 1-liter water bottles, because it's apparently not possible to sit in a climate-controlled room for 90 minutes without at the risk of dehydration. Now, they're all drinking all the time. Anyway, but they also come with their coffee if it's in the morning. So I asked them, "Where'd you get your coffee?" They went to whatever place, Tim Hortons, Starbucks, whatever it is. And I said, "Well, did you call ahead?" I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, did you call ahead?" And said, "I'm coming down there. I'll be there around 10 after 8. I'd like your coffee. Could, you know." I said, "No." "So how'd you do it?" "Oh, I just walked in." I said, "You walked in, walked up to a total stranger and said, 'Hey, I would like your coffee. And I'd like it right now.'" I said, "Isn't that rude?" So would you walk into a friend's house, just walk in there, say, "I would like a cappuccino with oat milk. I want it right now." I was offered that tonight, a cappuccino with oat milk. She said, "Whole milk or oat milk?" I said, "Whole milk." She said, "Oh, oat milk, it was not noisy." So I was alarmed, so I spelled it out, lest I don't even know what oat milk is, but anyway. But the point is, people do that all the time, right? You know, I could be driving home and I decide, okay, right at this moment, I decide I would like to get a milkshake. So I'm going to drive into that place and want a milkshake right now. I don't even want to wait 3 minutes for it. That's rude behavior, right? You would not tolerate that from your friends. I mean, you tolerate it if you have teenage children, but because you don't have a choice. See, raising children is not the science of human freedom, by the way. It's a different thing. So what's going on there? that we expect that strangers will provide for what we need right away, in a way that we wouldn't even expect of our friends or family. So what we see here is that it's possible in this world of voluntary exchanges for different human freedoms, even on a very large scale, to coordinate, to cooperate. That's really amazing, actually. It happens all the time, right? So you're at home and you decide, for whatever reason, I would like to have, I'd like to buy cleaning supplies. You go out and get cleaning supplies. I'd like to buy a shovel because it snowed. Get a shovel. You don't have to call anybody, you don't have to tell anybody. So you have all these different freedoms now that find a way in the economy to coordinate. And that's pretty impressive, because if you ask yourself, where in my life do I cooperate with strangers? You never cooperate with strangers in your home. Now, your family is very important, but you don't cooperate with strangers there, right? At work, you don't cooperate with strangers, like your colleagues at work, right? Probably not even in your church. But if you want to know, where do I cooperate with strangers? It's in my economic transactions. That's where I cooperate with strangers, right? I would surmise that most of you go through most of your days without being asked by someone close to you, how may I be of service to you? Or you may not say that to anybody, but it's not uncommon to hear that in a store. How can I help you? How can I be of service to you? Are you being served? Right? These words are all very good, just for our purposes, Christian words. They're not exclusively Christian words. So you find here that actually, when we talk about more than one person acting, right, it's not just a science of liberty of an individual, but a science of liberties. Well, we call that a market. So we call that. But the science of markets actually should be, in a sense, not only a not dismal science or a joyful science or an admirable science, but a kind of awe-filled science. It's wonderful, right? It's far more impressive that a city of 1 million people like Ottawa, or a city of, 25 million people like Mexico City, manages to feed 25 million people a day. It's way more impressive than a lioness tearing apart a decrepit water buffalo. Right? But we don't make a lot of documentaries about that. It's way more impressive than even some of the great natural wonders, like, how tides work or how planets orbit, right? And that's what economics allows us to see. And so if we allow that if you want to say that economics in that sense is really the science of free people cooperating, then from a Christian point of view, it looks like a very attractive thing. Right? It's different than the sort of original idea that may be there, that it's the science of rivals who are in a desperate competition for scarce resources. That's how I think too many people think about economics. That's more the science of cooperation. Now, it is true that in a market economy, there is competition, but the competition is rather limited in that it's between one firm and another firm, and to a certain degree between one buyer and another buyer. Right? But if you go into a supermarket, it's true that that supermarket is competing with another supermarket. But when you go into that supermarket, everybody in that supermarket, all the people who work there, the owners, their suppliers, are engaged in a cooperative activity. And when you go in there, you're included in that cooperative activity. Right? If you go into the supermarket and say, where do I find the peanut butter? The clerk doesn't say, hold on a second, and then he runs over there, grabs the peanut butter, and hides it from you. Right? He's not in competition with you. He's actually there to help you. And most of our economic activity actually is in a cooperative nature. I mean, there is competition, but the competition, like when you go to work, you're cooperating with other people you work with. If they're uncooperative, you may not work with them for much longer, right? So you get to this point of a science of not just liberty, of individual liberties, but of liberties, mass liberties, that's a science of cooperation and service. I think that's a pretty noble way to look at human activity. And that's where I think the science of economics shows the value of liberty much more than other sciences do, much more than the natural sciences. Okay, so I'm going to stop there.
I wanted to actually just give you an opportunity to start by giving you an opportunity to expand on, at the beginning of the lecture, you were talking about how some Christian economists don't emphasize liberty. They'll emphasize other things like equality. And you alluded to the fact that if you start with liberty, if you start with equality, or start with other values, that it will take you into a different place. And I think you wanted a chance to expand on that. So
okay.
Back with that.
Well, first of all, I mean, without doing a long history of economics, the scriptures are concerned more with distribution, wealth distribution, and wealth creation. So if you look at the regulation of the common life for the children of Israel, it's more concerned with distribution than with wealth creation. And that continues right throughout even the New Testament, although you do see in some of the economic examples that Jesus uses, some of the parables, you see a kind of a somewhat of an ethic of wealth creation there, but it's not the dominant thing. And the reason is because if you look at the history, the economic history of the human race, really the sort of economic output was constant for century after century after century. It's only around 1400 and maybe actually close to 1600 that you see sustained economic growth. And that's why really, I mean, we can talk about economics in the medieval period or even the patristic period or even the ancient Greek philosophers. We can talk about economics there, but actually economics really starts in probably the 17th century, formalized in the late 18th century. So very recent, because the phenomenon of economic growth is a relatively new thing. And only when you have widespread economic growth do you begin to think about wealth creation rather than distribution. So the Christian tradition is, the religious tradition of the world is based on the question of distribution, not growth. And that's really changed in the last, say, 50 years, because now it would not be possible to sustain 8 billion people in the world through distribution if there wasn't massive wealth creation. So this is a relatively new thing. Now, I'll just make one point in Catholic context. So really, it's only about 150 years, a little bit less, that in Catholic sort of formal magisterial teaching, that is teaching of the popes on economic matters, that's first of all itself a new thing. You have sort of two traditions, and you have one tradition starting with Pope Leo XIII of the late 19th century, who says there are people who are suffering. That's his question. How is it that their suffering may be alleviated? And so he'll get to answers regarding wealth creation and wealth, but of human freedom in the service of wealth creation. I'm not suggesting he's, a libertarian economist, but that's where he starts. That's the kind of question answer he gets to. Then you have others who there's a starting point, inequality. So, for example, in the 1930s, Pope Pius XI. And if you're interested in inequality and you want to redistribute, well, redistribution through the market is a kind of a messy, and you're not sure how it's going to end up. So you tend to prefer redistribution through the state, and you have more state outcomes. And if you look through for us Catholics, the tradition, you have people in the Leo tradition, I would say, is my argument. John Paul II would be in that tradition. And then you have people in the Pius XI tradition on redistribution, and people like Pope Paul VI and Pope Francis would be more in that tradition. So it depends a lot on what your initial question is, right? And if your question is about inequalities, you'll usually end up with more state-centered solutions. If your question is about alleviation of hardship, then you're going to tend to go in the direction of creativity and enterprise.
Okay, thank you for that. I wanted to take the intervention on Malthus and and ask.
Here's our man right here.
There
Front
you
row.
go. Yeah, and Dan Albus at the back too. But the I wanted to ask a quasi theological question and try to connect the economics with the theological, and that's so. If I understood what you were saying, correct me if I'm wrong. The solution to the arithmetic and the geometric problem that Malthus points out is is um, is creativity and is ingenuity that from the on of the human person, and that a necessary condition for those things is human freedom. I'm curious what that says about the relationship between man and God, and what that relationship looks like, uh, specifically on the creativity side of things. Does that make sense? The what I'm trying to get at is is how human beings participate in that creative aspect.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll answer the way I think maybe it's the wrong answer. You sound like you have an answer already. You might
Well,
just give the answer.
It's,
But
it's something. Yeah, go ahead.
so I would say this is that the answer to that problem that Malthus sketched out, or the mistake he made, is that obviously population growth is geometric. I mean, that's evident. You don't have to be a great statistician to figure that out. So the only solution can be that resource growth or agricultural yields or whatever you're measuring also has to be geometric. Otherwise, there's only one solution to that problem. If one thing you know is going to be geometric, the other one has to match it. And so you say, well, it's matched because human creativity and ingenuity doesn't, proceed in a strictly linear fashion. So when you discover oil, it's much different than before you discover oil, or any number of economic innovations. I just use energy because, or nuclear power or hydroelectric, whatever. I mean, hydroelectric, I guess, is the oldest of those. It's because energy is life. So whatever you do needs energy. So when you make a big advance, it changes everything. So where does that creativity come from? Well, the Jewish Christian answer to that, or even Islamic answer to that, would be that man is creative because he's made in the image of God who creates, right? And so that would be the theological basis for human creativity. And it's analogous to procreation. When I say procreation, I mean the common meaning of that term is about biological generation of children. And we talk about it procreation because there's an essential element of the human spouses, but they're not they're participating in something that's greater than themselves. Right? Very specifically, the creation of a human soul is not something they're capable of, so they're procreating with participating in creation by God. And the danger there is that you can come to regard what you have created as belonging to you. Right? So your people or your children belong to you as kind of possessions, and you don't recognize that they have been procreated. They're not entirely your own work. The same thing analogously applies in the economic sphere, is that we can regard our product as something that wholly belongs to us, and therefore is wholly to our desires, in terms of its disposition, and we're not participating in something that is participating in something that's bigger than us, right? So in the Christian world, biblical world, we would use the terms domination to explain the first, and stewardship, the more common biblical term to use. The steward is in charge of something, to be sure, but it's not his to dispose of in any possible way. There's a certain order he has to respect in it. Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, that's
happy to be of service.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm only going to ask one more question, then I'll turn it over to the audience. I could pull on a number of different threads, but I think I'm going to ask about constraints in liberty, and what a Christian view of freedom or liberty is. Is I guess I'll just put it simply: is freedom and liberty from a Christian perspective, shall I say, absolute? And if not, what do the constraints look like?
Well, it's a good sort of rule of thumb is that if you say is X absolute, the answer for a Christian is always no, I suppose. I mean, unless you're talking about God's power, I suppose. Because any good thing is good in its proper order, or maybe order to its proper end, right? So you could say is, well, let me maybe love or justice. You can't say, could you have too much love? Could you have too much justice? I think that, okay, in that sense, you could have absolute love, absolute justice, I suppose. But in a world where there are limits and trade-offs and so forth, even good things, for example, take for example the debate that we had in many countries over the last few years, and especially with regard to the pandemic, about safety, right? So safety is a good thing. But could you have too much safety? Could you have too little risk? Yeah, it's possible, right? So can there be too much freedom? Or better probably way to put it would be that, are there any limits on how I should use my freedom? If we think in terms of just human society, you'd say, well, the traditional answer is that my freedom has to be at least be limited by not doing harm to others, right? So my freedom to play music in my backyard is limited by the fact that I shouldn't do it at 2 in the morning when my neighbors are trying to sleep. That's in terms of, so there's those limits, and you could have very minimal. There are people who have a very maximal idea of liberty, and that would be the only limit, is when I run into somebody else's freedoms. But vis-a-vis God, the answer would be that if he's the author of my freedom, then my freedom has to be exercised at a minimum in a way that's not contrary to what he desires for my good, right? So that would be the limit on human freedom. I just end with this, is that the big conflict in the world today between competing ideas of freedoms is, one school would say that the capacity to choose is itself the end, right? So that the fact that I can choose, that is what's most important. My autonomy to choose, my capacity, that's what freedom is. And vis-a-vis that, the Christian idea has always been that your freedom is so that you can choose the good. So it has to have reference to what's being chosen, right? And I think that's actually not a very hard point to argue, because to go back to the restaurant example, if the waitress came over and I just said, I get to choose what I have. She said, what do you have? I said, don't worry, don't box me in. I'm just choosing. Right? Well, at a certain point, you have to choose something. Otherwise, what's the point of being able to choose? Right? Probably best summed up by attributes to Lord Acton, right, who said, late 19th century, Lord Acton, who said that freedom is not the capacity to choose anything, to choose what we want, but rather the capacity to choose what we should, or what is good for what we ought to do. So that would be, and that's really, when you talk about conflicts between religious people in a pluralistic society, it's usually about some differing idea of human freedom.
It makes me think of positive and negative rights as well. Freedom to do something or freedom from something.
Right.
This is a sub question, so it kind of counts.
Okay. Sorry.
So I just wonder if, well, I see you nodding, so I'm just wondering, can you just take a minute just to give us something about that?
I was nodding in sympathy with the frustrated audience who's waiting for you to finish the moderator's point. Yes, that's a different angle on it, but yes, you can have traditionally more liberty-oriented folks emphasize negative liberty because that can be achieved by other people or the state not doing something. A positive freedom, which would be sort of the capacity to do something, usually requires somebody else to do something to facilitate that. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but if it requires somebody else to do it, then you get into the question of how much should be coerced or not, right? So I'm going to forget what they are now, but FDR's famous 4 freedoms was freedom from fear, freedom from want. Anyway, there's 2 others ones. Not very good, 2 out of 4. But he combined negative freedom and positive freedom there, right? So freedom from want requires somebody to do something, and then that puts an obligation on others. So but certainly the Christian tradition would embrace both.
Thank you for that. I will turn it over to the audience now. So we have a microphone, and I think at the back first, Monica, Mr. Albus.
If anybody knows it's going to bother me. I didn't remember FDR's four freedoms. So if you know what they are, just tell me.
Hi, I'm Dan. Great tonight. I think everyone is just enthralled with a lot of it. And so one of the things you've said a number of times is the Christian tradition or Christianity, rather than saying Jesus said this or Jesus said that. I find that Jesus actually says things along the way to a bigger lesson. Mm-hmm. And it's usually thinkers that come after that try to parse what should we do in this state to live a Christian life. Mm-hmm. So my question would be, you seem to be more talking about the creative element to things. That seems to me to be more the Thomas Aquinas, where he did a lot of work to try to open up more discussions around wealth development and that it was okay to do it versus many of the Platonic approaches that were done earlier. Would you say that Thomas Aquinas would be more of that kind of thinker, or who would be an example instead of just talking about wealth distribution or normative traditions that have been passed on, whether it be Judeo or Christian, and lean more towards that open-ended, creative, human type of economics that you're discussing tonight?
I'm not sure I follow entirely, but I'll answer as best I can. Then if there's something I've left out, you can tell me. I think that you can find a lot of economic wisdom, both in the Pentateuch in terms of the regulation of life of the Jewish people, and then also in the Gospels, especially in the parables and elsewhere. So I say the Christian tradition, that might be more Catholic way of just speaking, but I think what I mean by that is that these ideas have to be reflected on over a long, or have been reflected on for a long time, and you get a kind of consensus about that. So that's to your first point. I think what you find in, the two principal figures that would shape Christian economic thought, are St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. You could say that they're the two principal thinkers who shape a lot of other things as well. So economics is not their main contribution. But I think from Augustine, we would get the idea very much that the order of, that we act according to the order of our loves. And if you ask people, what do you do? If you ask ordinary people, what do you do every day that manifests the order of your loves? Actually, a good answer to that is I work, right? Either like work in the home or work for wages or whatever. The way that most people actually demonstrate their loves is by their economic activity, the reasons why they work and what they use their money for, or what they use their wages or productivity, or even if you want to get before that, their talents for, right? So even there, when people talk about St. Augustine and the order of the loves, they want to talk about the city of God and the city of man and political loyalties and, where do you, how do you make priorities between this world and salvation and all that? All of that is true, but actually on just a simple daily basis, if you ask people, what motivates your economic activity? It's usually, for most people, it's actually a reflection of their order of their loves. I work because I want to provide for my family. So that's a very important idea that St. Augustine gives us. St. Thomas, follows more on the Aristotelian side. And so he would follow Aristotle's kind of provision for the household. So he'd emphasize not so much the order of loves, but emphasize the virtue of prudence, of ordering things to their proper end, right? So Thomas would give us the idea that in making this choice, whatever it is, could be very apparently small choice, I'm ordering it to some end, which is then ordered hopefully to my ultimate end, right? Of being a disciple of the Lord Jesus and, with the hope of eternal life, of salvation. So that also is helpful in the way we think about economics, because oftentimes we we look at what's right in front of us, and we're actually say, is it connected to anything else? If you follow it through, it is connected to something else, even though it might be a small thing. So I think, I mean, I could probably give you a better answer if I thought about it longer, but I'd probably say the primacy of charity is actually what Augustine gives us, and then the value of prudence, which is very much tied up with the idea of, trade-offs and incentives and ordering things to their proper end. Is that all right? Okay. Okay, all right.
Paul Lozon. Excuse me if I'm going a little bit off topic, but I'll have another glass of wine if I do so. Thank you for taking us to a bird's eye view of the mystical body of economics. It was quite interesting to see all that. But where those freedom comes from, and who do we depend on for keeping this freedom? We're not talking about just speech, which is being eroded quite a bit now, but the economic freedom with digital currency coming out. What kind of how is that going to affect our freedom to spend? Well, the decision of spending or how much we spend would be taken away from the individual to the state or another entity. Can you expound a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I would argue, first of all, that everything I said today, or probably most of what I said today, I mean, it could apply even in a totalitarian, centrally planned economy, right? Because even though externally you are constrained in your freedom, you still have some decisions that remain yours, even within that system. So in that sense, some of the points I made, or the idea of understanding how our economic behavior is, might even apply in a constrained, even if it's under constraint in, say, a centrally planned or even totalitarian economy. So I think that remains. But more broadly speaking, if you say there's a value to economic liberty, there's a value to economic liberty undergirding other liberties, then erosions of liberty in the economic sphere are something to be concerned about. And traditionally, but anyway, for the last, say, 200 years, you probably thought about limits on economic freedom as coming from the state, right? Because they would control a market or influence a market or suppress a market or whatever, right? That kind of thing. If I understand your question correctly, there are now other economic actors that are large enough that they could limit your economic freedom, right? So this would be private actors, especially associated with big tech. On cryptocurrencies or digital currencies, I'm not going to say a lot because I don't really understand them. I would also observe that many people who don't understand them also are very heavily involved in them, and unsurprisingly, that doesn't end well. But I don't know a lot about how digital currencies actually work. The questions I have seem to think I don't understand something fundamental because I don't understand why we have them in the first place. But anyway, that's a different question. But more broadly, there are economic centers or centers of economic power that are sufficient that they can limit freedom. The difference, though, is when the state limits economic freedom, it does so sort of using its coercive power, power of the law. When a private company wants to potentially limit your freedom, it has to offer you something. You have to agree to it. And so it's a slightly different dynamic, right? So, many things that make my life more convenient require me to give certain information, right? So I don't know if you ever used a airlines app. It's magnificent. You find all the information, things you don't even need to know, like where was this plane 3 days ago? Where was it flying? Or that it was on time, whatever. You can find out where your bag is at all times. I mean, so there's many things, but you have to give them something for that to work, right? So you're giving them knowledge about, usually what you're giving them is knowledge about what you're doing, what you've done, and so forth. So there's a voluntary nature to that. What most likely what's going on there from an economist's point of view is there's a lack of full knowledge of what is it, like, what are you actually giving up? Because it doesn't appear that you're giving up something, right? About 2 years ago, when I renewed my car insurance, the insurance agent said, well, here's this thing. It was called My Advantage. So there's a My Advantage program. So I immediately became suspicious because, so would you like so what's My Advantage? My Advantage is you get a 10% discount on your premium if I'm not sure how they do it, but anyway, they basically track everything you're doing, right? So where you're going, how fast I presume how fast you're driving and so forth. So I said to the very cheerful woman on the phone, I said, that sounds kind of like your advantage rather than my advantage, right? So, but I don't know if I made a good choice or not. I'm actually a pretty good driver. I don't make a lot of claims. Maybe I should have taken the 10% and let them know where I'm going. I don't really go any place that interesting. But I don't know. I chose not to. I said, I'm not. I'll pay the full rate. I don't want you to know everything I'm doing. I don't know why I decided that. But I'm open to the fact that I made the wrong decision. Maybe I should have taken a 10% discount, and because the information I would have to give to them wasn't really worth very much. So that's the difference in the tech world, which we usually talk about big tech, is that it's a volunteer. You're asked to give something, and is it really something serious or not serious? I don't know. I mean, much of the information that I think would be collected about me, would I be bothered by it? It makes my life more convenient. But the specter behind that is that maybe you get into a situation where unwittingly you've given up too much, and then it's too late. That's, I think, what people worry about. But yeah, what's that? 40% discount. Oh yeah, sure, 40%. That's how I'll phone in myself. I'll tell you where I'm going. So,
Other questions? Yeah, here, and then we'll go. Oh, okay, we'll go there, and then Tim behind. Okay.
He deserves at least one question
There you
for
go.
getting the Thomas
Absolutely.
Carlyle right.
Thank you for your presentation. I don't know whether you defined liberty. You really put a good definition, but if we call it freedom of choice, and I want to bring in the last lecture when you talk about the work. And I know Cardus, the published on the new work model, that type of thing. But we used to talk about the working poor. And my question about liberty, and you read it in the papers today, people don't have the liberty. It used to be a third of your wage went to rent, your home rent. Now some people are paying 2/3 or more. So for the working poor, for those people with 2 or 3 jobs just to survive, what does liberty mean to them?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. Thank you. That would be, if you wanted to address a critique of the presentation I gave, you would say, well, that what appear to be voluntary exchanges are maybe not so voluntary, right? So, and this has been it's a very valid critique that sometimes, I mean, the assumptions we make in economics don't always prevail in the world, right? So we presume that people don't have market power. That's not always the case. People do have market power. We assume people are free to make decisions. Sometimes they may find themselves not free to make decisions. So, for example, if you're if you're a fisherman and there's only one person who buys fish in your locale, is it really a free transaction? So, so that's a valid critique, is to say that what appears to be voluntary is not voluntary, and actually people are not free, and because they're not free, they're prone to be exploited. That would be the critique, and it's not unreasonable. It's a reasonable critique. The question of how do you respond to that is that there's 2 broad approaches. One is to say, okay, there's a lack of freedom here, and therefore someone with more power, in this case probably the state, will intervene to come to the aid of those who are vulnerable by constraining the transactions in some way. The other broad approach would be, how can we create a situation in which those who don't have choices do have choices, right? So that would be, so for example, in say welfare economics, that's a big, or social assistance programs, that's a big issue, is that do you have more and more state regulation to protect the vulnerable, or do you try and allow them greater scope to exercise choice and freedom in their arrangements? But it's a valid. I mean, I'm glad you raised that, because that would be a objection, is that, okay, it's fine to talk about freedom, but I don't have real freedom here. But thank you.
And we'll go here.
Thank you. You noted that economists are very interested in choosing between eating pasta versus steak.
Mhm.
Economists are also very interested, of course, in not just choosing between two goods today, but choosing between consuming today and consuming tomorrow.
Right.
And the topic of investment and savings are obviously ones that economists hold dear. And of course, one of the driving forces behind the Industrial Revolution, certainly in England, was people investing and saving in order to invest. And many of those who drove that Industrial Revolution were themselves very religious people. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the Christian tradition comes at these issues of trade-offs over time.
Well, one thing about I would say that if you look at the parables in the gospel, there's a very healthy sense of thinking in the right way about the future, right? So not feeling that you're so secure that you're immune from anything, but also not being reckless and not preparing for the future, right? That's a common theme over time to provide. I would say that in terms of our contemporary economy, the most fundamental scriptural critique would be that the scriptures are wary about debt and what debt does, both economically and, if you want to say, spiritually, or what it manifests was that in a certain sense, debt means living beyond my capacity today. And but the world of today, you'll find some, I mean, they're not maybe a majority, who speak about debt as a good thing or something not to worry about. We live in a country that has, I think, over $1 trillion debt. Our neighbors have a $33 trillion debt. So we've learned that we're very nonchalant about living with huge debts as a country. And then, as we know, one of the concerns that our financial observers remark is that we have very high levels of personal indebtedness. So most Canadians are quite content to live in a country with massive debts and provinces with massive debts and households with massive debts. And I would say that's the balance. The scripture is very worried about that. It doesn't treat debt with the nonchalance we treat today. To make a broader point, the whole world of finance, and especially, I think in the last 30 years, the financialization of our economy has changed the way we think about the relationship of freedom to goods to saving and investment. And all of a sudden, the world of finance used to be, if I can just say generally in the past, about investment, which means some evaluation of some good, to, if I might use a pejorative term, manipulation, or maybe a more neutral term, speculation. And that's also, I think, from a Christian point of view, because, I mean, the heart of the productivity of the modern economy is its symbolic capacity to represent one thing with another, currency, money, etc. But when those representations become so distant from the reality that they lose their correspondence, then we become to live in a world of unreality. And living in a world of unreality is contrary to the Christian intuition about things. So I would say probably debt and finance. To think biblically about debt and finance today makes you very nervous about where we're at.
Any other question over here?
Oh, okay.
I exercised my freedom to explore what the four freedoms were, and that's the freedom to worship, the freedom of speech, the freedom from
Fear
what?
and freedom from fear.
From fear. So there you
Okay.
go.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah,
Thank
no
you.
problem.
He's from Holy Cross, by the way.
Oh, very good. Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
You
The
can-
delegation. from
Joel over there
Cupid.
had a question, and he should.
Okay.
In the
Well,
white
we're gonna.
shirt.
Well, Kathleen has the microphone, and then we'll go to.
Oh, hello,
I
Kathleen.
apologize for this is a sort of an amorphous question because I'm still trying to organize my own thoughts. My initial thought was, how come there's no good bookstores anymore? But it's like everything is a chain. Every single mall you go to has the same stores in it. My husband and I used to go to a coffee shop on Bank Street who had the unfortunate location of being like 2 doors down from a Second Cup. And the fellow who ran it, uh, he was telling us that he would stand there and he would watch people who would look into his coffee shop. The name was Fahrenheit. Not that it matters, but anyway, they'd look into Fahrenheit, they'd think, and then they'd walk 2 doors down and go to the Second Cup. And his theory was people love predictability. And it may not be the world's best cup of coffee, but it's, I know what I'm going to get if I go there. I don't know what I'm going to get if I go into Fahrenheit. And that people choose predictability over quality. And eventually, when he figured out that he was working for less than minimum wage, he closed his coffee shop. But is this why there's more and more giant, like, you know, giant stores like big international like corporate like Walmart? Like, how come there's Walmart and not small stores? How come there's Loblaws and not local grocery stores? Is that people valuing predictability more than anything else? And but then they get to the point where they realize that they really, you're stuck with only 2 or 3 different places to shop. Like, is there anywhere to go except Chapter's Indigo now? Like, there's no other alternative bookstores. Like, you can convenience yourself into a situation that you don't actually like. So, and then you get to the point where these giant corporations are like more powerful than governments, and they tell the governments kind of what regulations they want for their industry. So now there's no way of breaking into it. If you wanted to start your own Walmart or whatever, the regulations are now impossible that you can't break into it. So now you got the corporations are controlling the governments, and it sort of seems like it's spiraled totally out of control.
Question.
So anyway, what's my question is, how come there's no good bookstores anymore?
And what does that say about the freedom when it's constrained like that?
Well, there's different parts there to what you said. On the last point, one of the it's important to make a distinction between a market of free agents or free participants and the world of business. But often in people's imagination, they go together. So, if you have a large company like Bell Canada or Amazon, that's a big business. Well, they're in favor of the market, but that's a mistake because they may be using their power to constrain the market. So if you can argue for economic liberty in a way that's consistent with arguing for at least to limit the capacity of big players to influence the rules of the market, right? And one of the things, by the way, that since the global financial crisis has changed, I didn't really see it at the beginning, but there's much less confidence today in the market or in free economic freedom than there was 15 years ago. And it's because many people, maybe even most people, saw what happened then and said, that's what free markets do. But the problem of the global financial crisis was not free markets. It was that you had highly regulated markets in which large actors were able to regulate to their advantage. However, it is discredited as a practical matter, economic freedom, but that's not, so Walmart is not economic freedom, right? And it's a problem for us in economics because our models on the microeconomic side of the theory of the firm is that firms don't have market power, right? So you don't have a firm that can determine all the terms that the suppliers have to conform to. So bigness is a problem for us in economic theory. But why does it happen? Well, because what we've seen, what really has, in the last, say, 70 years or so of really expanding global trade, is you began to see a separation from the interests of suppliers or producers and consumers. When you're talking about relatively local environments where the producers and consumers live in the same environment, there can be a balance between what I save and what the producer's incentives are. But when you have gains from trade, which really open up the whole world, then you can have these massive economies of scale that lead to big chains that can provide very low prices for people who shop at Walmart or buy their coffee beans overseas or whatever. That's a that's a relatively new thing in economics, because before, just the physical constraints of the world meant you had to produce and grow and buy in somewhat of a similar environment, right? So that's why Henry Ford paid his workers more, because he needed somebody local to buy his cars, right? That's 1910s. But if you can pay the people, but if you can make your cars in a place where you don't have to pay your workers more and sell them in a different market, that changes the balance. So you might describe this as that the interests of consumers have dominated the market. And although you may prefer a slightly more expensive book or cup of coffee, what most people seem to prefer is, cheaper goods. And the consumers, and that leads to these big companies. So I don't know if that's kind of an amorphous answer, but in fairness, you asked an amorphous question. So
Okay, how much, two more questions? Okay, so we'll go there, and then I think there's one over there.
So we intervene in the market all the time to limit choice, right? I can buy an MRI for my dog, but I can't get one for my kid in the private market here.
Right.
Many of those decisions are things we come to collectively, and the primary mechanism through which that occurs is the state. Some of those decisions occur at the national level. Think about the army being a natural case at the national level. Public parks occurring at the municipal level. Is there any teaching, Christian teaching, that gives us a sense of how the principle of subsidiarity applies when we're thinking about limiting freedom, or specifically economic freedom, to guide what level of intervention is appropriate? Should we have a national farmer care program, or is that something that should be left to provinces and municipalities, or should we just leave it to the most efficient level,
right,
even though that really increases the distance between the decision maker, the individual choosing, and the people making choices for them?
All right, so I'll just say, Joel used the term subsidiarity there. So subsidiarity is a term from Pius XI, actually, who kind of invented it, I suppose, in 1931. So subsidiarity, broadly understood, is that it's better for decisions to be made at the level closest to the people they affect. So better to have a municipal control of your school than federal control of your school, if it's possible. But the idea is that there's certain things that get to a stage where the locality is not able to meet the needs, so it has to be done by a larger entity. And usually the armed forces are the most common example of that, is that you need to have a national armed forces. So how do we think about subsidiarity? Well, the larger the things that you think that should be dealt with, then the larger the entity is going to be to deal with them. So if you want to have, if your goal is to achieve free access to pharmaceuticals for people across the country on a relatively equal basis, there's not a lot of actors who can achieve that, right? So in a certain sense, especially if you look at C.S. Lewis, he was in favor of equality as a metaphysical and legal principle, but he was nervous about it as a political principle, because he said, in order to make things equal, then if you don't want to have a different cost of drugs in Liverpool as opposed to London, who's going to do anything about that? Well, not the Liverpudlians aren't able to do it, and the Londoners aren't able to do it. So somebody has to come in above and kind of regulate that. Okay? So you can't have true subsidiarity unless you're willing to put up with what we would call today inequality. And we use that, as soon as we use the term inequality, we've already made a negative judgment about it in our current ambiance. So why is it that you can't get an MRI or can't pay for an MRI? Is because if we permit that in certain places, it means that there'll be an inequality. And we say health is important, we don't want inequality there. And so we Same thing in education. We don't want inequality. So there is guidance in the Christian tradition on subsidiarity, but it runs up against the current. I would say, let's put it this way: equality is also a Christian ideal, but at the moment, I would say it's become a dominant. Like there's several goods about in the public make up the common good. Equality is one of them, but equality has a very larger footprint today, and almost inevitably, when you have equality, then you're going to, if you want more equality, you're going to end up with more state intervention, which is why sometimes economists who are actually very fundamentally committed to people's creativity and flourishing and so forth have a kind of a negative connotation today. I mentioned two of them, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, because what's thrown up against them is that this leads to inequality. And they would probably concede that it does, but it achieves other goods. But now there's sort of a, once equality is the framework, there's not a lot of room for debate. So you mentioned the pharma care. Do we have a proposed program, or it's in the idea? I didn't know if it was in this budget that came out this week, but it wasn't. Okay. So there's the farmer care proposal, and then there's a concern about the cost. Those are the only legitimate objection to it would be on cost grounds. It would cost too much. You would hear very little objection on subsidiarity grounds, like why should X power do something for the whole country? Why can't people figure it out or leave it to the market or whatever? At least to my observation of that debate, the only acceptable objection is that it costs too much. So if you could imagine in some alternate reality, someone arrived and gave the national exchequer $200 billion, there would be no reason not to have a national farmer care program, I think.
Okay, and then I think we already have one last question. No, I think there's someone had already indicated, and that will be unfortunately last question, but there will be time afterwards to discuss. I mean,
amongst themselves.
Offline. Yeah. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Raymond. I was interested in hearing more about when earlier you were talking about how human freedom and creativity is a lot, like mostly, or your love is expressed a lot through what you do, like what kind of work you do, and then what you spend your wealth on. And then you were mentioning that, for example, you would spend your wealth on like providing for your family. And something that occurred to me was that it seems like in the more agrarian societies where it was just like there wasn't geometric productivity, they were just a lot more limited, like in what they did and on what they spent on, because they basically had to consume everything they produced. And now we have a lot more freedom about what we do with the specialization, and then we also have a lot more like options with how we like spend our wealth, and we can have a lot more decadent lifestyles basically. So in that sense, would you say that we're basically able to express our love better than they were before? Or is it like at the end of the day, the more important thing is like spending it to support your family, for example, which is something people could always do?
So the key point there in the context, so St. Augustine is talking about this at a time when, economic outlook doesn't change very much, in the 5th and 6th centuries. So he was really talking about the motivation for economic activity. So if you ask me, why do I work? Or put it this way, say, how do you spend your time? Your time is your most valuable thing. How do you spend your time? I spend X number of hours working on my farm or in a business or whatever. Why do you do that? I do it because I want to use my time, my energy to provide for those that I love. That's how I want to use my freedom. So it expresses what is important to us. What you're getting at, so that's always the case, at whatever age you live in. Now, it is true that today we have a great capacity to choose our occupations, what we work at, right? So the question we often ask people, what do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to be when you grow up? For most of human history, that would have not been a reasonable question to ask, because you do whatever your father did, or you did whatever the local lord decided that you would do, right? So you didn't have that capacity to choose. So the fact that we have this capacity to choose, and we can earn at a level, we have more discretionary income, that is true. It can give us a greater sense of the choices I make can express what I love. I just want to make the point that you're always able to engage in economic activity to provide for those you love. So you're motivated by your loves. But today there is this, or not just today, but in recent times, you can choose what kind of work you want to do. And St. Augustine would say that choice that you make is influenced by what you love, right? Do you love service? Do you love ambition? Do you love power? Do you love, maybe you love the arts or whatever? You can reflect. So he would say that all of our choices reflect to a certain degree what we love, right? So one of the things, as a spiritual reality, I suppose we should probably not be bad to conclude on that. On a spiritual reality, for the disciple, you can say, what did my economic behavior reflect about what is important to me, right? So if someone looked at my spending, or looked at my income, or looked at my economic choices, what would they know about me? Would they know something? So, for example, am I generous with others? Do I share my wealth with others? Do I invest, or do I borrow? Right? That a lot of our character and our values is reflected in the economic choices, which is what maybe I'll end here. That goes back to my starting point, is that economic freedom is the second most important liberty, or economic activity is so important, not because sort of ontologically it's more important than other things, but because practically that's where we spend our time, right? So if you say to someone, if someone says, I'm a very careful, cautious person, then you say, but you've got 40% of your annual income is indebted to credit cards. That's not the mark of a careful person, right? Your indebtedness belies it, or vice versa, whatever example you want to use. So I think that is true. Our economic activity, if we're free, our economic activity shows what we use our freedom for, and what we use our freedom for shows us what we value.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And let's give Father Raymond a thanks.